Hello, everyone. I'm extremely humbled to be here today, particularly in this room. I've presented on the Oxford offsetting principles hundreds of times, but it really is this community that we wrote the principles for. Or rather, we wrote the principles for the world, understanding a huge gap in what we need to achieve and scale by 2050 to meet net zero. But we realize that it's people like you who are going to have to do it. I'm Axelsson. I work at the University of Oxford in a hybrid role. I do research and I do what I love, policy engagement, to try to drive the transition towards a high integrity net zero set of pathways. As our moderator has just nicely teed up for me, the Paris Agreement led to a huge mobilization effort on net zero. And it's clear that the world, in fact, has committed. Every year, we do a stock take. We have hundreds of student volunteers who look at progress to net zero. And we are finding that across cities, states, regions, companies, and NGOs and universities, net zero is the new North Star. It's the new direction. And the new South Star, for those in the Global South. But there are conditions. When we look under the hood of many net zero commitments, we find varying degrees of quality in the transition plans set out to get there. And a huge area of potential loopholes in these targets are the companies and organizations, entities that are setting targets and thinking they might rely on offsets, but not outlining how and not specifying conditions or restrictions. It's quite clear that we need negative emissions. There is not a single IPCC model deemed credible that suggests that we can meet our temperature goals without some degree of negative emissions. Now, of course, scientists disagree on how much and where this might come from, and there's also disagreement as to what types of negative emissions we would need. But the fact that there is consensus that there's going to be a huge need for removals and removals with long-term storage kind of put inspiration into the community that works on thinking about academic principles for carbon offsetting and carbon markets to consider, are carbon markets achieving that outcome or helping us to scale the removal capacity that we need? And when we took a look in 2021, when we wrote the principles in the first place, we found no, not at all. At the time, less than 1% of the voluntary carbon market had any removals in it at all. And this, we thought, was perhaps a grave problem if a lot of companies, entities, organizations around the world were going to rely on these credits to claim net zero or a like term, like carbon neutral. So we set out back in 2021, before even internationally agreed definitions of net zero were out in the world through consultation, we set out to write the first iteration of the Oxford offsetting principles. And it's here that I have to give a huge piece of gratitude to my many, many co-authors. I like to joke, although it's not a joke, that it took us not one, not two, but 3 rounds of UN negotiations before we finished our internal peer review process for the Oxford offsetting principles. And that's because it was a truly interdisciplinary exercise. We brought together biologists, economists, policy leads, lawyers, folks who work in deep geological reservoirs testing the safety of some storage capacities. We had people who are anthropologists who are looking at the kind of social uptake and social acceptability of different types of offsetting approaches and carbon removal approaches. And we came together every single week to debate about what net zero aligned offsetting could really look like. We even had a debate when we decided to revise the principles in line with the latest science and the new net zero policy that has emerged in the last 4 years, thankfully. We even had a debate about whether we should throw out the term offsetting. If you've been on LinkedIn lately, you've seen fierce and wild debates about whether and how and if, and ideological positions and scientific and technical positions on offsetting. And we thought, perhaps the term is confusing, confounding, perhaps it's packed and as passionately debated as there are views about how we solve the climate crisis, as we should be debating. But we thought we would keep the term because it's a good hook. It's the thing that people recognize. And we wanted these principles not to sit in an academic library, but to be something that practitioners, entrepreneurs, and policymakers could primarily use. So as an entry point, we kept the term offsetting, but we included some grave, grave concerns about current practices. One of the concerns is that in the time that we originally released the principles, between then and now, we have not actually managed to close the carbon removals gap hardly sufficiently enough. In fact, as we continue to emit, that gap only grows because the need for removals or negative emissions increases. And so we also found that it's not 1%, but it's around 4% of the voluntary carbon market has any removals in it at all, and those are usually mixed land-based removals with climatological challenges. Of course, they're important. But this was something that we felt we needed to emphasize, and so we decided to release an updated version of the Oxford Offsetting Principles that also acknowledged the sort of new insights from the science and the policy, and includes a lexicon to help those who are navigating the challenging landscape of terms like net zero, carbon neutral, positive, negative, you name it. So Principle 1 has not changed. It has always been the case that the community that is trying so hard to scale removals is burdened with the challenge that there could be a moral hazard attached to focusing so much on something that could help us compensate ongoing emissions. This is not something that our community can afford to ignore. And there are studies, in fact, one is about to come out, suggesting that companies that buy more credits contrary to many industry reports, are actually sometimes in danger of not taking as much urgent action on reduction. That's something that we need to be very clear about. If you can reduce, technologically, economically, you must. This is not something where we have the kinds of removal capacity or the luxury at this point to have an either or. That said, on the other side of the coin, there's equally the moral hazard that if we don't start scaling this removal and storage capacity today, it's not likely to be there as a safeguard when we need it to try to hit the net zero target date. And as we're already seeing in the news headlines every day, climate change is here and with us now, and it's time to start solving. So this very simple flowchart, the kind of thing you might see in a Teen Vogue magazine, helps us to think through that prioritization. And I think leading companies around the world who are really investing in removals understand that they are prioritizing their reductions, along with investing in largely more expensive, high-integrity removal technologies. Of course, a final piece of this is that they must update their strategies in line with best thinking and practice as they go. Another thing that we updated about the Oxford Offsetting Principles is the question of what the mitigation hierarchy means. I'm not sure, perhaps a show of hands, who has heard of the mitigation hierarchy? Okay, about half the room. So this actually comes, it's a concept that comes from conservation science, from biology, which says that you should avoid destroying nature, then you should mitigate the amount that you destroy nature with new developments, and then you need to balance or restore nature if you have been disruptive. The same principle applies from a carbon perspective. We should try to avoid emitting if we can. I would rather take a train than fly here. We should try to mitigate, we should reduce our emissions, and we should counterbalance the emissions that we're unable to. However, there's a really important and very nuanced policy challenge with the way that the mitigation hierarchy is written in standards and policy today, and it's a sequential problem. Today, in the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, and in some emerging policy on kind of climate pathways, it's written, first you reduce, then you remove. Unfortunately, the IPCC shows that we don't have the luxury of waiting on either. And so we've clarified in this new version of the Oxford Offsetting Principles that you don't wait, you don't just reduce and see how far you can get, and then in 2045 hope that you have the removal, storage, and capacity to meet net zero. You have to start ramping up the store and the stock of removal capacity that you think you might need for those residual emissions by 2050. So Principle 2 is in line with what I shared about the challenges in the voluntary carbon market not having enough removals, is that companies and entities across the world that want to set out credible net zero strategy should gradually shift towards carbon removal approaches. Today, it's a lot cheaper and a lot more accessible to buy what we call avoided emissions credits. But of course, over time, if we want to scale that removal and storage, we're going to need to shift that strategy. It doesn't have to happen overnight, and it may in fact not be desirable that it happens overnight, but we should be setting KPIs year on year for how we're doing that. We also wanted to help the practitioner community. This may be an incredibly obvious slide to the removal community, I will admit. But we wanted to help the practitioner community break apart what they're buying when they look at the voluntary carbon market or even the compliance market. So there are kind of broadly two types of credits that we outlined, and we said there are emission reduction credits and carbon removal credits. Within the emission reduction credits, the one that people sort of tend to think about the most are replacement activities like renewable energy, clean cook stoves, things that help other people not emit. Avoided emissions from the biosphere would be avoided deforestation credits. These are your protected areas. These are already kind of modeled into our global net zero pathways because they're already natural sinks that we think already exist. And so using them as kind of a long-term way of meeting net zero might not be credible unless you do something like restore that nature and enhance those things. And then that becomes a removal. We understand that this is very challenging because it could be the same project. You're protecting an area and then you're supporting it, you're taking care of it, you're restoring it. But it's only when you restore and enhance those things, when you steward that land or that nature, rich biodiverse ecosystems are the best at this, of course, that you get the kind of removal tag. And I get lots of questions on LinkedIn, which is really fun, where people are like, this peat bog over here, is it a reduction or a removal? And then I have to go back to the Core Hub that has just released the incredible CDR report that you heard about in the last session and ask them questions like that. Of course, it's not easy to develop this kind of taxonomy, but it does help us think through, are we adding or are we just preserving the status quo? Then on the removal side, of course, there's a difference between the type of nature that removes and stores carbon. Of course, it's very easy to think about the kinds of monoculture, non-native species, these horror stories that unfortunately take up too much of the headlines as to kind of the perverse incentives. When we set a single metric like carbon, people sometimes go crazy and they end up planting a bunch of things in hope that that can meet the metric. But if we're not considering holistically the adaptive communities that need to be a part of that solution, if we're not considering the rich biodiverse ecosystems, there's a lot of science that suggests that those stores don't last as long. And they don't have as many co-benefits because they're not supporting the community. Then on the final piece, we have the carbon removal to the geosphere. These are your biochar or your DACs, your remineralization options. These are your more permanent and largely more expensive stores. But we have some very good examples, I think, in this room of people developing these. They have a lot lower risk of reversal, and you can see that we didn't put a time period on the types of carbon removal stores. We really tried to create a gradient based on risk of reversal, because we think that this is a more true representation of the potential of different types at a high level. These types also don't come with as many co-benefits, and that's the trade-off that we wanted to acknowledge. So I wanted to draw out some of these distinctions even further. One of the things that I learned on this job is that what we broadly call carbon capture and storage can be both a reduction and a removal. CCS at point source, if you think about a little mushroom cap around an industrial pollution, is really just reducing the emission that was about to happen. Direct air capture, of course, is sucking something out of the atmosphere directly, and that's what we would consider a removal. And principle 3 is to shift towards this kind of, I think it's my right-hand side, shift towards the lower risk of reversal options, because we acknowledge that carbon dioxide has an extremely long lifespan in the atmosphere, 1,000 years roughly, and it's really important that we don't just punt the problem to future generations to maintain net zero. Net zero, like really anything that we have to do, not only has to be met, but has to be sustained. So what does greenhouse gas removal look like? I keep this slide for when I teach my students, but I think this room could probably paint a better picture than I could possibly on what it looks like. But most of the community thinks it's trees. And it'd be nice if they thought of this kind of nice landscape. Of course, there's so many different types of natural storage options and technological storage options. I like to just put this little illustration on the page, but I'm extremely aware at the moment that you all could probably list out for me 100 other little icons and types that are being explored. And that's a beautiful thing. I think it's really rare in the sustainability and kind of climate crisis thinking that we get to say, grow, explore, innovate, and this is one of the few communities where we get to encourage that. Another important distinction I think I've drawn out, but it's powerful visual representation, is that not all nature has the same carbon storage potential. Rich, contiguous ecosystems with native species of many kinds, including animals, store carbon. It's kind of strange to think of animals as storing carbon, but insects as well. It's also important to look over on the sort of afforestation side. And I like to tell the story of the paperclip machine. Does anyone know the paperclip machine? It's basically just a kind of anecdote about how if you point a single metric, we end up kind of in the wrong place. This is the idea that someone was really, really good at their job and they developed the perfect paperclip machine, and then it drowned the whole world in paperclips. We can't be affording to just think only in terms of carbon with carbon blinders on. We have to be holistic in our approach to all sustainability. And the fourth, and I think actually most important and most underestimated principle, is that you can't just be a passive player in this market. As I mentioned at the start, the market has a long way to go to be what we would call a net zero aligned offsetting market. And so you need to be putting in place active measures to scale and innovate the types of solutions that are going to store carbon over the long time frames. This doesn't mean that you would necessarily abandon your investment in projects that have helped us to learn. These avoided emissions projects from nature, for example, have helped us figure out how to build integrity into the voluntary carbon market. And we can build on those insights for traceability and a whole other host of core carbon principles. But it's critical that we begin rapidly ramping up the store of long-term carbon storage, whether that's extremely well-governed nature in less climate risk environments or technological solutions. And there are some extremely exciting financing options for doing this. The kind of advanced offtake agreements that we're starting to see, the clubs of companies who are coming together to say, you know what, we're going to collectively finance this, even if we're not going to be able to claim a credit out of this project for 10 years. These are the brave and considerate players in the market who are saying, we won't accept the market as it is in its completely unfair price fluctuations. We are going to drive an outcomes-based market from the perspective of science and what the world needs. And my message to all of you today is really one of gratitude. You are the people who are coming together to make sure that we don't forget what carbon removal and storage requires. And that is an ecosystem approach, and I hope all the 45-minute coffee breaks that you get later on today will help to create so many new ideas to help the world, policymakers, companies, and entrepreneurs scale the types of solutions we're going to need to get anywhere near our temperature goals. Thanks so much.